When my wife and I moved into the house, I wasn't too keen on it from the start. The place was big, sure, and had plenty of space, but there was just something about it that I didn't like. Maybe it was because it used to belong to her previous husband. It felt like a reminder of the past, something I wasn't all that interested in. The house itself was in good shape, spacious, cozy, with enough room for both of us to have our own space. But there was one part of it I didn't like at all, the basement. The basement was cluttered with all kinds of junk. Boxes stacked on boxes, old furniture, and things that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I offered to clear it out a few times, but my wife was adamant about keeping it all. She said it was important, memories and whatnot, and I didn't argue. I had my work to focus on, which kept me busy most of the time anyway, so I figured it wasn't worth starting a fight over a bunch of old stuff in the basement. I had a lot on my plate with work, and I was often out of town or working late. That made it easy to just ignore the basement and everything in it. Besides, my wife was happy with the house, and I didn't want to mess that up. I wasn't about to get into arguments over things that, to me, were trivial. She could keep all the junk she wanted down there as long as it didn't get in my way. One day, my wife's friend came over for a visit. They were in the kitchen chatting, and I was in the living room, half listening while I went through some emails. I heard the friend mention something about a room, and it caught my attention. I asked my wife what her friend meant by that. She waved it off, saying her friend was just talking about the basement. She mentioned something about it being remodeled or fixed up, which struck me as odd since I hadn't heard anything about it before. The way she brushed it off didn't sit right with me. It wasn't like we had talked about remodeling anything, let alone the basement. I thought about pressing her for more details, but she changed the subject so quickly that I let it go. Maybe it was just some misunderstanding, I told myself. There were more important things for me to worry about, like work deadlines and keeping up with everything else I had going on. Still, it stayed in the back of my mind. I wasn't the type to let things bother me, but the way my wife had dismissed my question so quickly made me wonder. I didn't want to be the paranoid type, and I certainly didn't want to start doubting her over something so small. So I let it drop, telling myself it was nothing to get worked up about. A few days later, I was in the basement grabbing some tools, and I took another look around. Nothing seemed different. The same old boxes, the same old junk piled up in the corners. I didn't see anything that looked like it had been remodeled or fixed up. Everything was as cluttered and disorganized as ever. I figured that if there was something going on down here, I'd notice it. And there was nothing. Just the same mess as always. After that, I decided to let it go completely. There was no point in making a big deal out of something that probably didn't mean anything. The basement was still the basement, full of junk that my wife insisted on keeping. I had enough on my plate without adding unnecessary drama to the mix. If my wife wanted to hold onto a bunch of old stuff, that was her business. As long as it didn't interfere with my life, I didn't care. A few weeks after we settled into the new house, my wife suggested we host a party for our friends. We both had a pretty big social circle, and the idea of having everyone over sounded good to me. It was a chance to break in the new place, let everyone see where we were living, and just enjoy ourselves. We spent the whole day preparing. My wife handled most of the decorating while I took care of the food and drinks. By the time people started showing up, the house was looking great, and everything seemed set for a good night. The party was lively. We had music playing, people were talking and laughing, and the whole place was buzzing. I was busy making sure everyone had what they needed, whether it was a fresh drink or something to snack on. My wife was the perfect host, smiling and chatting with everyone. It was one of those moments that made all the hassle of moving worth it. The place really felt like a home with everyone there. At some point during the night, I was making my way around the rooms, just checking in on everyone. That's when I noticed my wife wasn't around. I figured she was probably in the kitchen or maybe outside with some of the guests. But as I moved through the rooms, I didn't see her anywhere. I asked a couple of people if they'd seen her, and they just shrugged, saying she was around earlier. It wasn't like her to just disappear during a party, especially since she loved being around everyone. I went out to the back patio, thinking she might be out there having a smoke or just getting some fresh air. No sign of her. I checked the upstairs rooms, even though there wasn't really any reason for her to be up there during the party. Nothing. I knew a few of her friends were missing too, and I wondered if they had all gone somewhere together. After a while, I went back downstairs. The party was still going, and I didn't want to make a scene or start asking everyone where my wife was. Maybe they had gone to grab something from the car, or maybe they were just outside somewhere I hadn't thought to look. It wasn't worth worrying about in front of everyone. It must have been about 20 minutes later when my wife finally reappeared. She came in through the back door, along with a couple of her friends. I walked over, asking where she'd been, and she smiled, telling me they'd just stepped out for a smoke. Her friends were laughing, and everyone seemed fine, so I left it at that. My wife went back to mingling with the guests, and I did the same. I kept an eye on her for a little while, just to see if anything seemed off, but she was her usual self, laughing and chatting like nothing had happened. I decided to let it go. The party was still going, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. There was no point in dwelling on it. The rest of the night went smoothly. We enjoyed ourselves, and the house was filled with laughter and conversation. Once the party wrapped up and the guests had left, my wife and I cleaned up a bit before heading to bed. A few days later, I came home from work earlier than usual. As I walked in, I didn't hear much noise, which was a bit unusual. Normally, my wife would be in the living room or the kitchen, but today it seemed quieter. I figured she might be in the basement, sorting through all that stuff she insisted on keeping. I decided to head down there to see what she was up to. When I opened the door to the basement and started down the stairs, I saw my wife and her friend standing there. They both looked up at me, clearly surprised. It wasn't like I had announced I was coming down, but their reaction seemed a little more than just being startled. They exchanged glances before my wife greeted me, and her friend gave me a small wave. I asked what they were doing, and my wife quickly explained that her friend needed an inflatable boat for her boyfriend. I looked around the basement, trying to remember if we even had an inflatable boat down there. The basement was full of old boxes, furniture, and things we never used. My wife pointed vaguely toward a stack of boxes and said it might be in there somewhere. I walked over, giving the boxes a quick once-over. Something about them looked off. They were stacked neatly, but some of them looked like they should have been heavier, yet they seemed almost empty. It struck me as odd, but I didn't say anything. Instead of wasting time rummaging through the basement, I told them I'd get the boat from the garage. I remembered putting it there when we first moved in, thinking it would be easier to access if we ever needed it. My wife looked a bit relieved when I said that, and her friend smiled, thanking me. I headed back up the stairs, leaving them in the basement. As I walked to the garage, I couldn't help but wonder what they were really doing down there. I found the inflatable boat right where I thought it would be, tucked away in the corner of the garage. I grabbed it and headed back inside. When I got back to the basement, my wife and her friend were still there, but they seemed more relaxed now. I handed the boat over, and my wife's friend thanked me again, saying her boyfriend would really appreciate it. I nodded, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. If they needed the boat, they could have it. After that, I decided to head back upstairs and let them finish whatever they were doing. My wife said they'd be up in a bit, and I didn't see any reason to stick around. As I left, I glanced back at the boxes again. They were still stacked neatly, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I wasn't about to start questioning my wife in front of her friend. If she wanted to keep whatever was in those boxes to herself, that was her business. I went to the living room and turned on the TV, trying to push the whole thing out of my mind. It wasn't like I had any real reason to be suspicious. My wife had always been good about keeping the house in order, and if she wanted to help her friend out, that was fine by me. I just couldn't help but feel like there was something they weren't telling me. But I wasn't going to press the issue, not yet anyway. A little while later, my wife and her friend came upstairs, chatting and laughing like everything was perfectly normal. My wife gave me a smile and asked if I wanted anything to eat. I shook my head, watching as they went into the kitchen. I decided to let it go for now. Whatever they were doing in the basement, it wasn't worth making a scene over. If there was something going on, I'd find out eventually. For now, I had other things to focus on. The following week, I got a call from work. My manager told me there was a situation in another city where they needed a specialist, and I might need to go there for a few days. They hadn't been able to find anyone local who could handle it, so I was their best option. It wasn't set in stone yet, but I needed to be ready to leave on short notice if it came through. I was used to this sort of thing, so it wasn't a big deal. I told them I'd be ready when needed. Later that evening, I sat down with my wife to let her know about the possible work trip. She took the news calmly, nodding along as I explained the situation. She asked a few questions about how long I'd be gone and what the job was about. It wasn't unusual for me to get called away for work, so she knew the drill. We both understood that my job sometimes required me to be away, and we had gotten used to it. As we talked, she mentioned that some of her old friends might come by while I was away. She didn't give too many details, just said they were planning to catch up. I didn't think much of it. She had her own friends and her own life, and if she wanted to have people over while I was gone, that was fine by me. I trusted her, and I didn't see any reason to question it. I told her it sounded like a good idea. It would give her something to do while I was away, and I knew she enjoyed spending time with her friends. She seemed pleased and thanked me for understanding. I wasn't the type to get in the way of her social life, and I knew it was important for her to have that connection, especially when I wasn't around. Over the next couple of days, I made preparations for the possible trip. I packed a bag with the essentials and made sure all my work documents were in order. My wife seemed to be in a good mood, mentioning her friends again and saying they were excited to come by. I nodded along, focusing on making sure I was ready for whatever work would require of me. The day before I was supposed to leave, I got the confirmation from work. They needed me in the other city, and I was set to leave early the next morning. I let my wife know, and she seemed genuinely supportive, telling me she hoped everything went smoothly. She also mentioned again that her friends would probably come by while I was gone, and I told her to have fun and enjoy herself. That night, we had dinner together, and everything felt normal. We talked about the usual things, what we needed from the store, plans for the weekend, just everyday stuff. I enjoyed moments like this, the simple routines that made life feel stable and comfortable. My wife seemed relaxed, and I was content knowing everything at home was fine. The next morning, I got up early, grabbed my bag, and headed out the door. My wife saw me off, giving me a quick kiss and telling me to be safe. I promised I'd call when I got there, and she waved as I pulled out of the driveway. As I drove away, I felt good about everything. Work was going well, my wife seemed happy, and it was just another routine work trip. I didn't have any reason to think otherwise. The next day, I left for the work trip as planned. The situation I was called for turned out to be a lot simpler than everyone expected. I managed to fix the issue quickly, much faster than the estimated timeline. With everything wrapped up, I decided it would be nice to head home early and surprise my wife. I thought she might appreciate me coming back ahead of schedule. I was in a good mood as I drove back, thinking about a quiet evening together. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a couple of extra cars parked nearby. I didn't think much of it at first, our neighborhood always had cars parked around. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. As soon as I stepped in, I noticed something was off. The floor had muddy footprints leading from the door and across the hallway. It seemed odd, considering my wife usually kept the place spotless, especially if she was expecting guests. I set my bag down and followed the trail with my eyes, trying to make sense of it. I decided to take off my shoes and clean up a bit. As I headed to the kitchen to grab a paper towel, I noticed the trash bin was a little overfilled. I figured I'd take it out while I was at it, just to tidy up. When I opened the lid, something caught my attention right away, an empty box of condoms sitting right on top. I paused for a moment, just staring at it. We hadn't used condoms in years. There was no reason for there to be an empty box in our trash. I took a step back, trying to process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. My wife and I had always been open about things, and I couldn't think of any reason why she would need condoms, especially not when I was away. A strange feeling settled in my chest, something between confusion and suspicion. I closed the lid and stepped away from the trash, my mind running through possibilities. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was hard not to. I walked through the hallway, my eyes drifting towards the basement door. That's when I heard it, a muffled thud coming from down below. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. My first thought was that something had fallen over. Maybe one of the boxes that were always stacked haphazardly down there. But given everything else I'd noticed, it felt off. I stood there for a moment, staring at the basement door. The muddy footprints led in that direction, stopping right in front of it. I listened, trying to hear if there was anything else, but everything had gone quiet again. My gut told me that I needed to check it out. Whatever was happening, it seemed like the basement was the place to start. Slowly, I walked over to the door and put my hand on the handle. I paused, taking a breath. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find down there, but I knew I had to look. The whole situation felt wrong, and I needed answers. The thud, the footprints, the empty box in the trash, it all pointed towards something I couldn't ignore. I turned the handle and opened the door, peering down into the dimly lit basement. As I started down the stairs, I could feel my heart pounding. The air felt heavy, and each step seemed to echo in the quiet house. I reached the bottom of the stairs and looked around, scanning the cluttered space. Nothing seemed immediately out of place, but I knew there was more to this. I took a few more steps forward, determined to find out what was really going on. Standing at the bottom of the basement stairs, I looked around, trying to figure out where that noise had come from. Everything seemed quiet, but something felt different. I noticed that some of the boxes stacked along the far wall were slightly out of place. They were usually piled neatly, but now they looked like they'd been moved recently. It was subtle, but enough to catch my attention. I walked over to take a closer look, feeling a growing unease in my gut. I started moving the boxes, one by one, setting them aside as quietly as I could. As I worked, I noticed a small gap forming behind them. I kept going, shifting more boxes until the gap became wide enough to reveal something I hadn't seen before. There, hidden behind the clutter, was a door. It was old, with a simple handle, and it looked like it had been there for a long time. I couldn't remember ever noticing it before, and that alone was enough to make me stop and think. For a moment, I hesitated. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find behind that door, but everything about this felt off. The footprints, the empty box in the trash, the strange noise, it all led me here. I put my hand on the handle, feeling the cold metal against my skin, and took a deep breath. Whatever was behind that door, I needed to know. I turned the handle slowly, and the door opened with a soft creak. Behind the door, I was met with a dim red light. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the strange glow. It was a small room, not much larger than a storage closet, but it was unlike anything I'd ever seen in our house. The walls were covered in some kind of soundproofing material, and the entire place was bathed in an eerie red glow. I stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop slightly, and looked around, trying to take it all in. There were items in the room, things that made my stomach turn. Intimate devices, toys, and other objects I didn't even recognize were neatly arranged on shelves and tables. The whole setup was unmistakably deliberate, like someone had gone to great lengths to create a very specific atmosphere. It wasn't just a storage room, it was a place meant for something else entirely. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing, and I felt a cold knot forming in my chest. I took a step further into the room, my eyes moving over the strange collection of items. There were cuffs attached to the wall, a large cushioned bench in the middle of the floor, and various other things that made it clear what this room was used for. The red light made everything look surreal, almost like something out of a nightmare. I couldn't believe that this was in my house, that this was something my wife had hidden away. There, in the middle of the room, was my wife, and she wasn't alone. She was with 3 other men, all of them completely oblivious to my presence. My head spun as I tried to process what I was seeing. It felt like my world had shattered in an instant. My wife, the woman I thought I knew, was there with those men, engaging in something that I could hardly believe. The red light made the entire scene look surreal, almost like a twisted nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. My mind went blank, and for a moment, I couldn't move or even breathe. I just stood there, frozen, watching something that should never have happened. It was the kind of moment that you never think will happen to you, and yet there I was, living it. In the corner of the room, I noticed an enormous toy, something I couldn't even comprehend being used. It added another layer of shock to an already unbearable situation. My wife, the person I had shared my life with, was involved in something I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. Anger, disbelief, and heartbreak hit me all at once, like a wave crashing over me. I wanted to scream, to do something, but my body wouldn't respond. I felt my hands clench into fists as I stood there, watching the scene unfold. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, seconds, minutes, it all blurred together. The men still hadn't noticed me, and my wife was completely absorbed in what she was doing. I couldn't believe that this was happening in my house, in a room I hadn't even known existed. The betrayal cut deep, and I felt like I was about to explode from the emotions boiling inside me. Finally, I took a step forward, the floor creaking under my weight. One of the men turned his head, his eyes widening as he saw me. The shock on his face was instant, and he quickly nudged the others. My wife looked up then, her expression changing from pleasure to horror in a split second. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I could see the realization dawning on her face, the understanding that everything was about to change. The room fell silent, the only sound being the heavy breathing of everyone involved. My wife scrambled to cover herself, her eyes wide with fear and shock. The men looked at each other, clearly unsure of what to do next. I felt my whole body trembling, my vision narrowing as the anger and betrayal threatened to take over completely. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there, glaring at each of them, the weight of what I had seen pressing down on me. My wife opened her mouth, as if to say something, but no words came out. She looked terrified, and for a moment, I almost felt a pang of pity for her. But the rage quickly swallowed it up. There was no excuse, no explanation that could make this right. I took another step forward, and the men started to back away, clearly wanting to avoid whatever was about to happen. My wife reached out a hand, as if to stop me, but I ignored it. I turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop to think. I knew exactly where I was headed. I made my way to the bedroom, yanking open the closet door and reaching up to the top shelf where I kept my shotgun. My hands were shaking, but the anger drove me forward. I wasn't going to let this go. I needed answers, and I wasn't about to ask nicely. With the gun in my hand, I turned and stormed back down the stairs, my grip tightening on the stock. I could hear the muffled voices from the basement, but I didn't care what they were saying. They had no idea what was coming. I reached the basement door, flung it open, and thundered down the steps, my eyes blazing with fury. The moment I stepped back into that red-lit room, I shouted, demanding to know what the hell was going on. The room fell silent. My wife and the 3 men all turned to look at me, their faces a mix of shock and fear. My wife was pale, her eyes wide, tears streaming down her face. The men looked stunned, clearly not expecting things to escalate like this. One of them, a smug-looking guy, had the audacity to try to joke. He grinned, raising his hands in mock surrender, and suggested that maybe I should join them. The words barely registered before my rage took over. Without thinking, I lifted the shotgun and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the small room, the red light flickering as the shot echoed off the walls. The bullet flew just inches from the man's head, embedding itself in the wall behind him. His face went white, and all traces of his smirk vanished. The other men stood frozen for a second, their eyes wide with terror before they scrambled to their feet, stumbling over each other in their rush to get away. Panic took over the room. The men ran for the stairs, not even looking back, tripping over boxes and each other as they tried to escape. My wife remained where she was, sitting on the floor, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. She didn't try to move, didn't even look at me. The fear and confusion in her eyes were clear, but I didn't feel any sympathy. Not after what I'd seen. Not after what she'd done. I watched as the men disappeared up the stairs, their footsteps echoing through the house as they bolted for the door. I didn't bother following them. They weren't my concern anymore. I turned my attention back to my wife, who was still sitting there, her shoulders shaking as she cried. My grip on the shotgun tightened, and I took a step closer, my voice low and filled with anger as I demanded an explanation. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. But no words came out. Just more tears. I stood there, staring at her, waiting for something, anything, that could make sense of this. But there was nothing. Just silence and the sound of her crying. The anger inside me burned hot, but there was also a cold emptiness, a sense of finality that told me whatever we had was over. After the chaos settled and the men had fled, I found myself alone in the house, the silence almost deafening. The red glow of that basement room still spilled out into the hallway, and I knew I had to go back down. There was something unresolved, something pulling me back into that space. My wife was still in there, her sobs echoing faintly from below. But I didn't care about her tears. My eyes moved over the clutter of intimate items, the cuffs, the red light. And then I noticed something that hadn't registered before, a small camera, mounted high in the corner of the room, its lens pointed directly at the center of everything. It was discreet, barely noticeable, but there it was, silently watching. My stomach turned at the sight of it. I moved closer, reaching up to take it down. The camera was connected to a small recording device, hidden away behind a stack of boxes. I pulled it out, the cords trailing behind as I set it on the table. I stared at it for a moment, my heart pounding, before I pressed play. The screen flickered to life, and I watched as images filled the display. My wife, the men, the acts that had taken place in this room. Everything was there, captured in cold, unflinching detail. My hands clenched into fists as I scrolled through the footage, each clip more damning than the last. There was no denying it now. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was planned, deliberate, something that had happened over and over again. My wife had been bringing these men into our home, into this hidden room, and she'd recorded it all. The betrayal cut deeper with each passing moment, the realization that this had been going on right under my nose. I felt a mix of emotions, anger, disgust, heartbreak. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had shared my life with, was a stranger to me now. I watched the footage, unable to look away, even as it made my skin crawl. There was no explanation, no excuse that could ever make this right. She had lied to me, betrayed me, and done it all without a second thought. And now, I had the proof right in front of me. I heard movement behind me, and I turned to see my wife standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked at the camera in my hands, and I saw the fear in her eyes. She knew what I'd found, knew there was no hiding from it anymore. She opened her mouth to say something, but I cut her off, my voice cold as I told her to save her excuses. There was nothing she could say that would change what I'd seen. She took a step forward, her hands trembling as she reached out to me. But I stepped back, shaking my head. I didn't want her anywhere near me. I turned my attention back to the footage, scrolling through more clips, each one a dagger to the heart. The room seemed to close in around me, the red light casting everything in a sickly glow. I felt like I was drowning, the weight of what I discovered pressing down on me. After a moment, I stood up, taking the camera and the recording device with me. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, but I knew one thing, I wasn't going to let her get away with this. She had taken everything we had and destroyed it, and now it was my turn to decide what happened next. I walked out of the basement, leaving her there, her sobs following me up the stairs as I made my way out of that hellish room. After that night, I knew there was no going back. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't shake. I didn't want to be there anymore, not in that house, not with her. I packed my things, moving through the house like a ghost, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. I didn't bother saying anything to her, there was nothing left to say. She knew what she'd done, and I knew that there was no way I could stay. I grabbed my bags and walked out the front door, not looking back even once. I checked into a hotel on the other side of town, needing a place to clear my head and figure out my next steps. Everything felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. The anger was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, but there was also a strange numbness that had settled over me. I felt disconnected, as if I was watching everything unfold from a distance. I knew what I had to do next, but the reality of it all felt like a weight pressing down on me. The next few days were a blur. I met with a lawyer, filed for divorce, and started the process of cutting ties with her completely. It was all mechanical, a series of actions that needed to be done, and I moved through them without feeling anything. The lawyer asked questions, went over paperwork, and I answered as best as I could. There was no point in dragging it out. I wanted it over, and I wanted it done as quickly as possible. I couldn't stand the thought of being connected to her for a moment longer than necessary. The rage, though, was still there. It was a constant presence, a reminder of what she'd done, of how she'd betrayed me. And as I sat alone in that hotel room, staring at the footage I'd taken from the basement, an idea began to form. She had humiliated me, destroyed everything we had, and I wasn't going to let her walk away from it without consequences. I knew what I had to do. It wasn't enough to just leave her, I wanted everyone to know what kind of person she really was. I started going through my contacts, thinking about who needed to see the truth. Friends, family, people who thought they knew her. I wanted them to see what I'd seen, to understand what she'd done. It was petty, maybe even cruel, but I didn't care. She had made her choices, and now she would have to face the consequences. I copied the footage onto my laptop, making sure everything was ready. I was meticulous, taking my time to ensure that nothing was left out. Once I had everything prepared, I sent the files out. It was a simple process, emails, messages, a few clicks, and it was done. There was no going back now. I watched as the progress bar filled, each message being sent off to someone who had once been a part of our lives. It felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, a sense of satisfaction that came from knowing she wouldn't be able to hide from what she'd done. She had lied to me, betrayed me, and now everyone would know. The responses started coming in almost immediately. Shock, disbelief, questions that I had no interest in answering. People were calling, messaging, trying to make sense of what they'd seen. I ignored most of it, letting the calls go to voicemail, the messages pile up unanswered. I didn't care about their reactions. This wasn't about them. It was about her, and about making sure she faced the consequences of her actions. I wanted her to feel the same pain, the same humiliation that she'd put me through. Eventually, I turned off my phone, leaning back in the chair and closing my eyes. There was a strange sense of closure in what I'd done. It didn't make the pain go away, didn't erase the betrayal, but it felt like I had taken something back. I had taken control, in a situation where I had felt powerless. And as I sat there, the hotel room quiet around me, I knew that I was ready to move on. The marriage was over, and so was the part of my life that included her. It was time to start over, to leave the past behind, and to figure out what came next. The fallout from everything that happened was swift and brutal. My wife's betrayal, captured on video and shared with everyone who knew us, left her in a situation she couldn't escape. People she considered friends turned their backs on her, family members who had once supported her now looked at her with disdain. The whispers, the judgment, the constant reminders of what she'd done, it all became too much. She realized that staying in the same city, in the same environment, was impossible. She had to leave. I heard about it from some mutual friends. They said she had packed her things and left, that she couldn't handle the shame and the way people looked at her. It wasn't a surprise. After everything that had happened, after the way people had reacted to the recordings, it was only a matter of time before she decided to leave. She couldn't stay here, not with everyone knowing what she'd done. The judgment was too much, and she needed to get away. They told me she had moved to a different city, somewhere far enough away where no one knew her. She needed a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life without the weight of her mistakes hanging over her. I could understand that, even if I didn't feel any sympathy for her. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. Leaving was the only way she could try to move on, to leave behind the mess she'd created. I pictured her packing her things, moving through the house that we had once shared, collecting whatever she could fit into her bags. It must have been painful, a reminder of everything she had lost. But that was her reality now. She had thrown everything away, and there was no getting it back. Leaving was her only option, and it was probably the best thing for both of us. I didn't want her here, and she didn't belong here anymore. The friends who told me about her leaving didn't have many details. They just knew she had found a small apartment in some other city, a place where she could disappear and try to start over. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a chance for her to escape the judgment, the whispers, the looks of disgust. She needed that, and honestly, so did I. The sooner she was out of my life, the better. I didn't feel anything when I heard the news. No relief, no sadness, no anger. It was just another step in the process of moving on. She was gone, and that was that. There was no point in dwelling on it, no point in thinking about what she might be doing or how she might be feeling. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. All I cared about was that she was no longer a part of my life. The friends who told me about her leaving seemed to expect some kind of reaction from me, but I didn't give them one. I just nodded, thanked them for letting me know, and went back to what I was doing. There was nothing more to say. She was gone, and I had my own life to focus on. The past was the past, and I wasn't going to let it drag me down any longer. It was time to move forward, without her. Maybe one day she would find some kind of peace, some way to move on from everything that had happened. But that wasn't my concern. She was no longer my problem, and I was done thinking about her. She had left, and now it was time for me to do the same, to leave behind the pain, the betrayal, and everything that had come with it. It was time to start over, to build a new life without her in it. It had been about a month since everything had fallen apart. I was doing my best to move on, to start over without her, but some nights were harder than others. I was still staying at the motel, trying to figure out what my next steps would be. One evening, as I was walking back to my room after grabbing a coffee, I noticed something, a figure standing near the edge of the parking lot. It was dark, but something about the way they were standing felt familiar. I squinted, trying to make out who it was. As I got closer, the figure moved, stepping into the light. My heart sank as I recognized her, my ex-wife. She looked different, worn out, almost desperate. I stopped, my hand tightening around my cup. I wasn't sure what she was doing there, but I knew it couldn't be good. She saw me and started walking towards me, her steps quick and frantic. Before I could react, she was in front of me, her eyes wide and pleading. "We need to talk," she said, her voice shaky. I didn't have time to respond before I saw movement behind her. 3 more figures emerged from the shadows, and my blood ran cold as I recognized them, the same 3 men from the basement. They were moving towards us, their faces set with determination. My ex-wife turned to look at them, then back at me. "They want you to delete the recordings," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I felt a surge of anger and fear. Of course, they were here for the recordings. They wanted to erase the evidence, to make sure no one else saw what had happened. One of the men stepped forward, his expression hard. "Delete the recordings," he said, his voice low and threatening. I looked at him, then at my ex-wife. She looked terrified, her eyes darting between me and the men. I knew I had to think fast. I clutched my chest, wincing as if in pain. "My heart," I muttered, stumbling backward. My ex-wife's eyes widened, and she rushed towards me. She knew about my heart condition, knew that stress could trigger an episode. I let myself fall to the ground, curling up as if I was in agony. The men hesitated, unsure of what to do. My ex-wife knelt beside me, her hands shaking as she tried to help me. I could see the confusion on their faces, the uncertainty. They hadn't expected this, hadn't planned for it. I waited, holding my breath, until I saw one of them take a step back, looking like he was about to tell the others to leave. That was the moment I had been waiting for. In one quick motion, I rolled onto my side, reaching into my jacket and pulling out the knife I had tucked away. I sprang up, the blade in my hand, and pointed it at them. The men froze, their eyes widening in shock. My ex-wife gasped, stumbling backward, her hands flying to her mouth. I stood there, my heart pounding, the knife steady in my hand. "If any of you come near me again," I said, my voice cold and even, "I won't hesitate. I will do whatever it takes to protect myself. I don't care if I end up in prison. I'll make sure you regret it." The threat hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. The men looked at each other, then back at me. They could see I wasn't bluffing. I meant every word. Slowly, they began to back away, their hands raised in a gesture of surrender. My ex-wife stayed where she was, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. I kept the knife pointed at them until they were far enough away that I felt safe lowering it. One of the men muttered something under his breath, and they turned, walking away quickly, disappearing into the darkness. My ex-wife stayed for a moment longer, her eyes locked on mine. She looked like she wanted to say something, but I shook my head. "Go," I said, my voice flat. "Just go." She hesitated, then turned and followed the men, her figure fading into the night. I stood there for a moment, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. My hands were shaking, but I didn't let go of the knife until I was sure they were gone. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I knew then that I couldn't stay here any longer. They had found me once, and there was no telling if they'd try again. I needed to leave, to put as much distance between myself and them as possible. That night, I packed my things, throwing everything into my bag with shaking hands. I had already decided where I was going, back to my hometown. It wasn't ideal, but it was familiar, and it was far away from all of this. I needed a fresh start, a place where I could rebuild without constantly looking over my shoulder. I couldn't keep living like this, always waiting for the next threat, the next confrontation. I left the motel in the early hours of the morning, the sky still dark as I loaded my things into the car. I took one last look at the place, the memories of the past month flashing through my mind. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. I had faced the worst, had stood up for myself, and now it was time to move on. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove away, the road stretching out before me. The drive was long, and the silence gave me time to think. I knew that what had happened would stay with me forever, that the pain and betrayal would always be a part of me. But I also knew that I couldn't let it define me. I had taken control of my life back, had faced down the people who had tried to break me, and I had come out the other side. I was still standing, still moving forward. By the time I reached my hometown, the sun was starting to rise, casting a golden glow over the familiar streets. I felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting off my shoulders as I pulled into the driveway of the small house I had rented. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A place where I could begin to rebuild, far away from the chaos and pain of the past. I stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. It was quiet here, peaceful. Exactly what I needed. I knew there was still a long road ahead, that healing would take time, but I was ready to face it. One step at a time, one day at a time, I would rebuild. And this time, I would make sure that no one ever took my peace from me again. It wasn't long after I settled into my hometown that my phone started buzzing again. I knew who it was even before I looked at the screen. My ex-wife was trying to reach me. The calls came in waves, her name flashing across the screen, her desperation evident with each attempt. I ignored them, silencing the phone and tossing it aside. I didn't know what she thought she could accomplish by calling me now. The damage had been done. There was no going back. For whatever reason, she seemed to think that if she begged enough, if she pleaded with me, I would delete the recordings. Maybe she thought that without the evidence, things would somehow get better for her. I didn't understand why she was so desperate for me to get rid of them. Everyone who needed to see it had already seen it. Her reputation was ruined, and deleting the footage wouldn't change that. But still, she kept calling, her messages piling up, her voice shaky and pleading in the voicemails she left. She talked about wanting a fresh start, about needing to move on, and how the recordings were holding her back. She said she couldn't live her life with the constant fear of the recordings resurfacing. She begged me to delete them, to let her move on without the weight of that fear hanging over her. But I had no interest in helping her. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. I wasn't going to make things easier for her after everything she put me through. The truth was, I had already moved on. I was in a different city, far away from her and from everything that had happened. I didn't care about the recordings anymore. I wasn't interested in using them against her, and I wasn't planning on sending them to anyone else. But I wasn't going to delete them either. They were a reminder of what had happened, a reminder of why I had left. I needed that reminder, at least for now, to keep myself focused on what mattered, building a new life, away from her. Each time the phone rang, I felt a mixture of annoyance and pity. Part of me wanted to answer, to tell her to leave me alone, to let her know that there was no point in calling. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. She would keep calling, keep trying to find some way to undo what had already been done. So I let the calls go unanswered, her messages piling up, her desperation growing with each missed call. It was sad, in a way, but it wasn't my problem anymore. She didn't know where I was. I had made sure of that before I left. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, hadn't left any trace of my plans. I wanted a clean break, a fresh start, without the risk of her showing up and dragging me back into the chaos. And now, as I watched her calls come in, I knew I had made the right choice. She was still trying to pull me back in, still trying to get me to fix what couldn't be fixed. Eventually, the calls started to slow down. The messages stopped coming as frequently, the voicemails growing shorter and more resigned. She must have realized that I wasn't going to answer, that I wasn't going to give her what she wanted. I hoped that meant she would move on, that she would finally understand that there was no fixing what had happened. I had moved on, and it was time for her to do the same. In the end, it didn't matter why she wanted the recordings gone. The damage had been done, and there was no erasing it. She would have to live with the choices she made, just like I had to live with mine. And as I sat in my new place, far away from her and everything that had happened, I felt a sense of peace. She couldn't find me, couldn't drag me back into the past. I was free, and I was determined to keep it that way.